Well, thanks, Mitch. So, as Mitch kind of mentioned, today what I'm really going to be talking about is cover crops, grazing, and soil health. So, they asked me to talk about the impacts of grazing cover crops on soil health. And so, the question I have to answer today is, can we have our cake and eat it too? So, can we get the short term economic payback by grazing and still improve soil health? And that's really what we're going to explore today. I am a beef systems specialist and I'm a ruminant nutritionist by training. So, of course, my bias is I'm really interested in trying to be able to utilize cover crops for a forage source. Over the years, I've been here about 7 years in Nebraska, and was really tasked with looking at integrated crop livestock systems. I have been able to collaborate with a lot of great people in agronomy and really have helped me learn a lot about the soils. And one of the most interesting things I think I've learned is how similar the soil is to the rumen, from the standpoint of it's all about the balance of nitrogen and carbon, in terms of feeding those microbes and improving the soil, which is pretty neat. So with that in mind, I think the first thing I want to do is kind of tackle that question about making money from cover crop forages, and I could give a whole different talk on selecting the species to fit your opportunity in terms of cover crops and to be able to maximize your forage production. But I did want to just take a brief minute here to make it clear that species selection will have a huge impact on whether or not you can really get enough grazing from your cover crop to make it worthwhile. And of course, that really depends on planting date and where you can fit it into your system. So you got to kind of ask yourself, when can I get it planted? How long of a growing season is available? What animal will I be grazing? So if I'm grazing, say, a growing calf, my selection of species might be more focused on quality than if I am grazing, say, a dry cow. I might choose to pick something that's going to put more biomass, but maybe a bit lower quality. And then, of course, when we're going to graze may have some impacts on species selection. The number one rule in my mind is that if forage is a goal, don't skimp on the grass, because grasses are the biomass producers, and they're going to be the one that's going to produce more forage and allow us to actually get more grazing. And that's probably all I'm going to talk about today. Of course, if you guys got specific questions that you want answers to related to species selection, related to grazing management, all of those things, we can definitely talk about that here at the end. So let's dive into impacts of grazing, cover crops, and soil health. So one of the experiences that really made me understand more about the use of cover crops was I went out to a producer's location, and we had 3 inch tall rye, and it didn't look like much. So it's an early March, and I'm like, yeah, there's not a whole lot going on here yet. And we took some soil probes, and it was really neat to see how far the roots had already went down. So 3 inch tall rye had roots all the way down to 30 inches, and this producer actually was seeding on 15 inches just because that was the planter he happened to have. We actually went in between the rows of the rye, and we could still get down to 24 inches and have live roots. So what's going on above ground doesn't tell you everything that's going on, because a lot of those impacts, of course, are below ground. And I think that's really great from using it as a forage perspective, because a lot of the benefits come from the roots, and so using that top growth can be a viable option. So let's just take a second, because one of the big questions I get, of course, is one of a goal that is often portrayed for using cover crops is I want to get more soil organic matter. And will grazing negatively affect the benefits of putting in a cover crop. So if we talk about, in this case, I have an example and I'm using late summer planted oats. So, planting oats in say mid-August, and I'm going to graze them in the winter, and they're going to be really, really digestible. So the cattle can actually get a lot out of it, which can be bad and good depending on your perspective. So from a forage perspective, that's a really good thing. But does that impact the organic matter benefits I might get? So here I kind of have diagrammed out, well, what if I just use those oats as a pure cover crop? I'm just going to leave them. And let's say we have a ton of dry matter produced per acre, and that's basically about 1,950 pounds of organic matter that's above ground and about the same below ground. Well, one of the key things to understand about organic matter benefits and cover crops is that the majority of those benefits come from what happens below ground, right? So about 70% of the soil stable carbon from those oats is going to be from the roots. So we have about 30% coming from that above ground biomass. All right, so we get about 500 pounds of soil stable carbon from that 2,000 pounds of dry matter. What happens if we graze it? Well, in this scenario, I just said, well, what if we graze off 70% of the top growth? So we actually consume 70% of that top growth. How does that impact our soil stable carbon or organic matter in the soil? Well, one of the things to remember, right, is that a lot of the benefit came from the roots, and we're not going to really affect that by grazing, especially for grazing something that's dormant. But even if we're not, a lot of the take half, leave half conversation that happens is about really the data based off perennial grasses. And with perennials, they act differently because they're wanting to maintain themselves year after year. And so they'll actually retract root growth, for instance, when they get grazed. Annuals don't really act the same way because their whole goal in life is to produce a seed because they want to have seed to replant for next year. So we don't see the same effects of grazing. I will tell you, however, that if we graze when they are seedlings, so when they're only 2 or 3 inches tall, we do see some negative impacts on root growth just because we actually impact the plant vigor. But after that point, we really don't see those same effects. So we're not impacting the root growth. We're still getting all that benefit from the roots. But what about that material that's consumed by the animal? In this case, it's something that's very, very digestible. It's like 75% digestible, so high energy, but that means 75% of it disappears. So 75% of what they consumed either stayed in the animal or went off as CO2. So only 30% of what they consumed became manure. So that doesn't sound very good. However, we got a little bit of an advantage because a higher proportion of the carbon in manure actually becomes soil stable carbon than the portion that would actually be in the plant material itself. So that's an advantage. Overall, even in a scenario where we have very high digestibility, we're still capturing about 90% of the organic matter benefits from an ungrazed cover crop compared to a grazed cover crop. So not huge impacts. And this does not account for any impacts of grazing and impacts on the soil microbial community and how that might affect how much of that above ground biomass actually gets comes soil stable carbon. So we increase microbial biomass, we may have some impacts on nutrient cycling, for instance. The other thing that's really important to understand is that when we graze, what disappears doesn't necessarily mean that's what's consumed. And in fact, in our oat grazing studies, we've done a lot over the years with really that kind of fall grazing, and we see a very high proportion of oats that disappears is actually not consumed. It's actually just trampled. In fact, somewhere between 50 to 70% of the oat biomass that disappears was actually just being trampled. And that's because if we're continuous grazing, so we're just kind of set stocking, you put a calf an acre out there and they graze for 60 days. we get a lot more trampling. Of course, if we start managing grazing like strip grazing, a higher proportion of what disappears will be consumption. But I think people really underestimate how much of that disappearance is. It's not really consumption, but it's just kind of trampling. I underestimated it for high quality forages. I know with stuff like sorghum Sudan, we see a lot of that on the ground and that they won't consume. But with this high quality stuff, it's really hard to see it. But they're definitely not consuming all of that. Well, yeah, we're talking about cover crops today, and I have a slide up here now that says corn residue grazing research. And I really just wanted to bring this up because it has some long-term data that I think is key to understand grazing impacts. So we've done a lot of studies across the state, especially with Humberto Blanco. And I really just want to talk about the one that's circled here, which was a long-term 16-year study. And what I wanted to talk about first was compaction, because that's a major concern of many people. Got cattle on the ground, they're going to compact it. So if we look at after 16 years of grazing corn residue, what impacts do we have on bulk density or porosity of the soil? So first thing to understand is that over here we have basically what we're seeing is that if we're shifted towards that would be more compaction theoretically. And then what we have is we have the depth. So we took samples from 0 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 6, and 6 to 8 inches. And the bottom line here is that we really just didn't see anything. When we grazed in the fall, we did not see any impacts on our porosity or our bulk density of the soil. And when we grazed in the spring, we still did not pick that up, even after 16 years. One of the things to point out here is that this is a line where we would actually start seeing maybe some impediment to root growth. And you can see we do have a line here where we're getting a little bit greater bulk density, so some more compaction at between 2 and 4 inches. This is long-term no-till. It's been no-till for 20 years, and we do see that shift, but all of the treatments really shifted there. Okay, so what about penetration resistance? That's another measure that some people use. Really look more at root growth and how root growth might be impacted. And it's also what you might observe when you're planting, for instance, and how much down pressure you would have to put on that planter. So again, as we shift from 0 to 2.5, that would be more pressure or more penetration resistance, which means that theoretically that could be more compaction. And again, if we look at the difference between fall grazing and no grazing, so they're over here, we see no differences between those two. When we start getting into spring grazing, you kind of see a shift, that we do see a little bit greater penetration resistance, which means that we could potentially impact soil root growth, or excuse me, root growth in the soil. However, there's the line where we'd actually start impacting it. So even though we did have some increase in penetration resistance, we really didn't get above the threshold where we start really seeing any impacts. And this is pretty consistent across cover crop grazing trials as well. If you look across the literature and you look across all the work that we've done, we do see a slight shift, and it seems like what we see is that right after grazing, we sometimes can pick up an increase in penetration resistance, but even a couple months later, we can't pick it up anymore. So the little bit of wet, dry cycles, for instance, and the microbial activity really negate that effect. So we don't see a lot of it building up over time. Okay, what did it do to the yield of the crop? This was in a corn soybean rotation. So we would graze the corn residue, we plant soybeans. Well, if we look at the impacts of spring grazing, so no grazing compared to spring grazing and no grazing compared to fall grazing, we do see there were some differences, but they're probably not the way most people would think. In this case, we have a very high yielding field in eastern Nebraska, and we see a little bit of an increase in soybean yields if we grazed in the spring, and a little bit more of an increase if we grazed in the fall. So overall, no negative effects, maybe a slight positive effect if we're grazing on that corn residue. Now, why could that possibly be? Well, this is actually some really cool information. It's the effect of having those cattle on the ground and the soil microbial community. So, what we saw is if we grazed, we saw an increase in the total microbial biomass, the amount of bacteria, and there's two classes that I thought were really interesting. One is this actinomycete bacteria. These guys were also increased by grazing, and they actually degrade hard to degrade material like cellulitic material. Well, cellulitic material would be corn residue. So they speed up nutrient cycling. The same thing with the saprophytic fungi down here at the bottom. Again, grazing increased that population, and so we can actually degrade the stuff that is left on the soil more quickly. That's a positive and a negative, right? Increased nutrient cycling, but now we need more soil cover to maintain soil cover because it's going to disappear more quickly. What about organic matter benefits? Well, in terms of grazing corn residue, we did not see any negative impacts. If anything, we're seeing potential for an upside, right? And that's probably because of what's happening with the microbes in the soil. So again, I think if we think about adding cattle, there can be more positives here than negatives, but you got to recognize there are some potential impacts, and one of those is some increases in penetration resistance. Although they're typically below the threshold that affects yield, and they are short-lived, we do see some of that change, and I think that's what a lot of farmers see and worry about, compaction impacting their crop yields. Do we see a difference in residue cover? Well, of course, right? We graze some of that, we see a reduction, and how much really depends on, of course, how much you graze. Our recommendations and the rate we'd recommend really for animal performance would result in about 20% removal in corn residue. It's about 13% of the corn residue they actually consume, and then some for trampling. However, that varies. If I graze in the spring and the same stocking rate and the same amount of grazing, and it happens to be very wet, we see a lot less soil cover in that area because they trample in a lot more. So we got to manage grazing to maintain soil cover, of course. We have not measured any difference in wind erosion, soil fertility. We really don't see any effects on soil fertility, at least no negative effects on soil fertility, but we do see some improvements, of course, in the microbial community, and maybe no effect depending on the trial, or slight improvements in subsequent crop yields. Okay, so now let's go to Brazil for a second, because this data I actually think is really interesting and useful to understand grazing density and how that management might impact the results. And so this is looking at penetration resistance in a corn, a soybean and oat rotation. So they're a lot warmer than us, so they get to graze a lot longer in a double crop situation. But really what I wanted to point out is they stocked to manage the oats at different heights. So here they'd have more cattle on less land, and here they would have maintaining at 16 inches, so less cattle on more land, so to speak. And one of the things they saw was a big difference in the number of steps per day that those animals took, which makes a lot of sense because here you're getting less intake in a bite, so they got to walk more and take more bites to get the same intake than here. Well, that resulted in a difference in penetration resistance. So this is kind of that threshold we were talking about before. This is in KPA instead of MPA, but so 2,000 instead of 2. But what we see is that if they had less steps per day and they managed with a lower stocking density, we see a lot less impact on soil penetration resistance than if they had more, which makes sense. So how we manage can impact even that effect on soil penetration resistance. And in this case, this would be, of course, unfrozen soil in wetter conditions. So we would expect more and more impacts, of course. But they also looked at things like microbial activity, which I thought was pretty interesting, that it's pretty much a linear effect. The more cattle, the more microbial activity they saw in the soil. So I think that that manure does have some benefits there from improving the amount of microbial biomass and really the activity. So the basal respiration rates also increase linearly with more cattle. But there's trade-offs. So the trade-off with penetration resistance, as we just saw, there's also trade-offs with worms. So this data, they were looking at worms in those systems, and grazing, having cattle, so the presence of cattle did have a real positive impact on the worm population, even when they kept the oats short, right? So even when they had very high stocking densities. But unlike microbial biomass, the response was really flipped, that the more cattle they had, and thus the less oat biomass they had, the less benefit they saw. So when they had moderate grazing intensities or even very low grazing intensities, they saw more impacts on the earthworms. So long story short there, management has an impact. And so that's something we've got to consider. More cattle pressure, we get more microbial biomass, will probably degrade the residue that is left more quickly. On the flip side, we do have less of a benefit in terms of worms, although grazing does increase worms compared to not putting cattle out there on that cover crop. It has less benefit if we put, say, too many and use up too much of that material. So now let's come back to Nebraska again, and let's talk about some dryland research. This is down in Lawrence, Nebraska, and we were looking at adding a cover crop into a corn, soybean, wheat rotation where we put a cover crop after the wheat. Of course, there they are in a lower rainfall situation, not quite like the Panhandle, but still a lower rainfall situation, and that's why they put wheat in the rotation, is to build up moisture, of course, for the subsequent corn crop. But we put in a mix of peas, triticale, oats, and some brassicas after wheat. So they actually put on some manure, of course, killed off the volunteer wheat, and then we planted this. So we didn't plant until April 14th in 2016. And then by about the end of August, I said April, I meant August, sorry. August, the end of August here, we see they've germinated, they're up, they're really starting to take off and start growing. By the end of August, end of September, we've really got a good stand going now. And the majority of it, though, would be really the grasses, so the triticale and the oats and the brassicas. The peas didn't really produce very much, which is not all that unexpected. They don't compete very well with our grasses. So they grazed it very moderately. In fact, they left a ton of biomass per acre. So this is kind of what it looked like. They didn't graze it very hard. They didn't take off a whole lot because, again, they were thinking about soil moisture. And the subsequent year, when the corn crop was growing, they got more moisture than normal. So about 5 inches more than normal, and they're really about a 25-inch rainfall annually. What did they see in terms of soil moisture? Well, the green here is the cover crop. The yellow is the grazed cover crop. And then they actually had no cover crop, which is the blue. And then they had one that was no cover crop, but where they allow cattle access. And I'll tell you, that one's not really that useful, because when they allowed access to the cattle had access to both the cover crop and that area, and they just lounged where they didn't plant cover crop because they didn't want to lay on those on the turnip tubers, which is kind of interesting. So they actually made that ground bare where there wasn't any cover crop. But what we see is that when we look at soil moisture, where they had the cover crop early in the spring, it did cause reduction in soil moisture, some soil depletion. The same thing where we grazed, we saw a more soil depletion of soil moisture, which is kind of what we would expect. By planting time, we had enough rain to get to field capacity, and all of them really were similar. But then over the rest of the season, what we see is that the where we graze the cover crop, it starts differentiating itself as having less and less soil moisture. And the same thing with where we didn't have cover anymore because the cattle had lounged in that area. So what does that mean? Well, soil moisture is affected, of course, by how much residue we have on the soil. And we had this increase in microbial activity that we talked about before, and we had what the cattle consumed, and the combination did result in some soil depletion. And what do we see? Well, if we just look over here on corn yields at the end of the slide, and you do see a reduction in corn yields. And this is about what we see normally. We put a cover crop in, even if we don't graze it, we see a reduction in yield compared to where we didn't have the cover crop. That made sense in this dry land situation with limited rainfall. And then if we look at where we grazed it, we still see that same reduction. So then they grazed the corn residue, and they grazed it lightly. They did not graze it overly. They weren't overly ambitious with the grazing, I'll put it that way. And we had a year where we didn't have as much rainfall as normal, so even less rainfall than normal. And we look at the soybeans, and boy, where they grazed, the soybeans don't look quite so great, right? They looked water stressed compared to where the non-graze cover crop was. And again, when we went out there and we looked, what we see is that most of the residue was gone very early on, and that's because of that increase in microbial activity and because of the grazing. So they did see a decrease in soybean yield. This is about a 10 bushel decrease in soybean yield. So that doesn't look too great, right? So what's the takeaway here? Well, soil cover can have huge impacts on soil moisture. And for those in the panhandle, they're all going, duh, right? We all know that. But I think it is important to understand that in dryland situations, we need to make sure we're leaving it enough when we graze to have enough soil cover, and that we have to account for the fact that we can really ramp up the microbial activity, and thus we may need to leave even more than you might have if you did not graze. Now, the question of take half, leave half, well, for me, it's all about let's concentrate on cover. So if I have a really high yielding crop, like I put in sorghum Sudan after wheat, and I get a really great year and I get 4 or 5 tons an acre, I can take more than half of that. But if I have a really low yielding cover crop, I may not even be able to take half because I need to concentrate on soil cover and having enough soil cover to prevent erosion, and in places where I don't have a lot of soil moisture, of course, maintain soil moisture. On the flip, if I'm in a really wet conditions, I might decide to take even more, again, still retaining the ability to prevent erosion, but I might want to be able to let it dry out a little bit more. So management varies and goals should vary. One last thing, looking at water infiltration, we have seen a negative impact of water infiltration due to grazing. Basically, in some situations, if we graze when the soil is wet and we graze really hard, we see that we can actually even negatively impact soil water infiltration compared to having no cover crop. However, in situations where we're more moderate in grazing, what we see is that we basically negate the benefit of the cover crop and we come back to about equal to not having a cover crop. So that's one downside of grazing. We've seen that in spring grazing on rye. We've also seen it in fall grazing on oats. That in this case, there was no significant differences, but you can see the same trend that when we were fall grazing and comparing it to non-cover crop, basically it gets back down to the same infiltration rate as no cover crop. So trade-offs with grazing double crop annual forages versus true cover crops. The advantages, the extra income can be a bonus. The increased microbial activity, that can be a bonus. And then I didn't show you, but we also see increased aggregate stability, probably because of the microbes and the extra glue that they can produce. Disadvantages, we can negate the infiltration benefits of the cover crop, and we can have less soil cover, which again, we need to account for in our management. The organic matter effects really aren't any different than putting that cover crop in, and we don't really see any compaction. So overall, I think there can be some positives here, and especially if you think about it like, well, if I am able to graze it, I'm going to plant it because it incentivizes me to plant it because I get an income. So then it really does make more advantages than disadvantages. But if you were going to plant that cover crop and you're trying to decide between grazing it or not, this is kind of how it stacks up. Okay, that's really all I have, and I'd be happy to take any questions if we have a few minutes.